You think narcissism appears suddenly, as if a person just wakes up one day and becomes cold, arrogant, unreachable. But what if narcissism doesn't explode? What if it grows silently over years, right in front of your eyes? And what if this explains why someone who once seemed warm now treats you as if you no longer matter? In this video, you will learn how researchers explain the development of narcissism with increasing age. You will begin to understand why some people become more self-centered, less empathetic, and more emotionally distant over time, and why this affects you so deeply. This understanding can change how you see yourself, your parents, your partner, and even your own future reactions. At first, narcissism often doesn't look dangerous. In younger years, it can even appear attractive. Confidence, ambition, a strong sense of identity. But as time passes, something shifts. And here is where the first pattern becomes visible. With increasing age, many narcissistic individuals develop a growing fear of losing relevance. When youth fades, when admiration becomes rarer, when attention is no longer guaranteed, the inner insecurity intensifies. Instead of reflecting, they compensate. They exaggerate their importance, their achievements, their suffering. You might notice how someone constantly talks about everything they've done, or how unfairly they are treated. Imagine a parent who reminds you again and again of their sacrifices, not to connect, but to control. And because of this, you start to feel guilty for simply being yourself. And here you start to notice another detail. With age, narcissism often becomes more rigid. Younger people can still adapt, apologize, or question themselves. Older narcissistic personalities tend to lose this flexibility. Why? Because admitting mistakes would threaten the carefully built self-image. So instead, blame is pushed outward. You see this when discussions turn into monologues, when your feelings are dismissed as exaggeration, when every conflict somehow becomes your fault. That's why you feel unheard. That's why conversations leave you exhausted rather than understood. But this is only part of the picture. Another change happens quietly. Empathy decreases. Research shows that empathy requires emotional energy and self-reflection. As narcissism grows stronger, attention turns inward. Other people's emotions become background noise. You might experience this with a partner who once cared about your day and now barely reacts, or with a parent who responds to your struggles with, "Others have it worse." Because of this, you begin to doubt your own feelings. You wonder if you are too sensitive. But you are not. You are responding to emotional absence. The situation becomes more complicated when narcissism meets aging expectations. Older narcissistic individuals often believe they deserve special treatment simply because of their age or status. Respect is no longer mutual. It is demanded. You see this in statements like, "I've earned this," "You owe me," "You should be grateful." These words are not about wisdom, they are about entitlement. And that's why you feel pressured instead of guided, small instead of supported. Another subtle development appears in how criticism is handled. With increasing age, narcissistic defenses become sharper. Any feedback feels like an attack. Even gentle suggestions are met with sarcasm, anger, or silence. Not because you are wrong, but because their self-image cannot tolerate cracks. You might remember trying to explain how something hurt you. And suddenly, the topic shifts. They become the victim. You become the problem. That's why you leave these conversations confused, drained, questioning reality. And now comes a pattern many people miss. As narcissism evolves, the need for control increases. Control over narratives, control over family roles, control over how you are perceived. This is why independence from such a person often triggers guilt-tripping or withdrawal. Not love, fear of losing influence. You might feel punished with silence, or with exaggerated disappointment. And because of this, you feel responsible for emotions that are not yours to carry. But something important happens when you start to see these patterns. You realize this development is not caused by you. It didn't start because you failed. It didn't grow because you weren't enough. It grew because narcissism feeds on avoidance of inner emptiness. In the next part, you will understand what this means for your boundaries, your healing, and your future relationships. Because once you recognize how narcissism evolves, you stop trying to fix what was never yours to fix. When you understand how narcissism develops over time, something inside you begins to shift. You stop asking, "What did I do wrong?" And you start asking a much more powerful question: why am I carrying responsibility for someone else's inner conflict? With increasing age, many narcissistic individuals don't become calmer, they become more defensive. Life has not turned out the way they imagined. Dreams were missed, recognition didn't last, control slipped away. And instead of grieving this silently, they project it outward. You might notice how they rewrite the past. Failures are reframed as injustice. Harmful behavior is justified as necessity. And suddenly they are always the misunderstood hero of their own story. That's why discussions about the past feel pointless. Facts don't matter. Your memory doesn't matter. Only their version survives. And because of this, you begin to question your own perception. But this confusion is not a weakness. It is a reaction to emotional distortion. Another change happens in how closeness is handled. As narcissism solidifies with age, intimacy often becomes threatening. True closeness requires vulnerability, and vulnerability would expose insecurity. So instead, emotional distance grows. You may feel that the relationship exists, but without warmth. Words are exchanged, but connection is missing. Support is offered, but only on conditions. That's why you feel lonely even when you're not alone. Why being near them doesn't feel safe. It feels tense. And here comes an uncomfortable truth. Many people hope time will soften narcissism. That age will bring insight, humility, wisdom. But research suggests something else. Without self-reflection, patterns don't dissolve. They crystallize. This means waiting for change keeps you stuck. Not because you are impatient, but because you are hoping for growth where avoidance has become a lifestyle. And now you begin to see why setting boundaries feels so difficult. Narcissistic personalities often interpret boundaries as rejection, as disrespect, as betrayal. So when you say no, you are met with coldness. When you distance yourself, you are accused of being ungrateful. When you protect yourself, you are called selfish. And because of this, you hesitate. You delay. You stay silent longer than you should. But boundaries are not punishments. They are clarity. Another pattern becomes visible with age. Emotional roles are reversed. You become the listener, the regulator, the emotional caretaker. They express frustration. You absorb it. They express disappointment. You explain yourself. This is why you feel older than your age. Why emotional exhaustion shows up early. Why rest doesn't feel restorative. But here is the turning point. Understanding does not mean excusing. Seeing the mechanism does not mean tolerating it. You are allowed to stop participating in emotional imbalance. You are allowed to disengage from circular arguments. You are allowed to protect your inner space, even from people who raised you or once loved you. And when you do this, something changes quietly but profoundly. You stop reacting. You stop over-explaining. You stop shrinking. Not out of anger, out of clarity. Because narcissism thrives on reaction, on emotional supply, on attention, even negative attention. And when that fades, the dynamic loses power. This doesn't mean cutting everyone out. It means choosing yourself without guilt. It means recognizing where responsibility ends. And here is the final insight. You cannot reverse someone else's inner development, but you can interrupt how it affects you. When you stop expecting empathy when none is available, you stop feeling constantly disappointed. When you stop seeking validation from someone who cannot give it, you stop feeling invisible. When you stop carrying what was never yours, you start to feel lighter. Understanding how narcissism evolves with age is not about labeling others. It's about freeing yourself from confusion. And once you see these mechanisms clearly, your life will not become louder. It will become calmer. Because the real power was never in changing them. It was always in understanding yourself.